There have been quite a few James Bond actors over the years, reaching a grand total of 9. James Bond is one of those iconic roles that can only be played by a truly amazing actor. It's a coveted role, but only one person can play it at a time.
Bond. James Bond.
Because of this, producers are very careful in selecting the actor for the job. But you may be surprised to hear that there are dozens of actors who were either considered for the role or officially offered the role. In this video, we're going to take a look back at all the actors who were almost cast as James Bond. Stick around until the end of this video to learn who might replace Daniel Craig as the next James Bond. Make sure you like this video and don't forget to subscribe to Facts First for more. Facts First presents These Famous Actors Turned Down the Role of James Bond. The first category in this video is actors who were considered by the casting directors for the role of James Bond, but were ultimately not chosen for the role. Trevor Howard was considered to play James Bond in 1961, but the casting directors ended up choosing Sean Connery instead. Stanley Baker was another actor considered in '61, but because he didn't want to commit to 3 entire movies, he was turned down. In 1962, Rex Harrison and David Niven were considered to play James Bond, but Sean Connery was considered a better fit. Ian Fleming, the original author of the James Bond novels, personally wanted actor Richard Todd to play James Bond in 1962. Unfortunately, Richard Todd was too busy, and ultimately the role was given to Sean Connery due to scheduling conflicts. Actor Jeremy Brett was considered for the role of James Bond in 1967. However, Brett was worried his career would take a hit if he accepted the role, and he declined. Peter Purves, Robert Campbell, and Patrick Mower all auditioned for the role in 1967, but the producers chose to accept George Lazenby instead. While the movie producers wanted Michael Caine to play James Bond in 1967, Caine declined. Because he had already played the spy Harry Palmer in 3 previous films, he didn't want to be remembered as a spy actor. Dick Van Dyke was a beloved actor, but producer Albert Broccoli was unimpressed with his fake English accent. Daniel Pylon was 27 years old when he auditioned for the role in 1967, but co-producer Harry Saltzman declined him because he thought he was too young. John Richardson, Anthony Rogers, and Hans de Vries were all very close to winning the role of James Bond in 1967, but George Lazenby beat them all with his impressive screen test fight scene. Terence Stamp was eager for the role in 1967, but he had so many ideas for future films that co-producer Harry Saltzman felt he was a bit too radical for the role. Eric Braeden was almost considered for the role in 1968 due to his impeccable British dialect. However, after co-producer Albert Broccoli learned he was not English, he decided not to choose him as the new James Bond. In Albert's opinion, only people in the Commonwealth would be the right choice to play James Bond. Poor Peter Snow auditioned for the role in 1968, but at 6'5", he was deemed too tall to play Bond. Oliver Reed tried for the role in 1969, but the producers felt his public image was too poor for any film with Reed to be successful. Cunate Arkin auditioned for the role in 1969, but for reasons unknown, he was not accepted. Between 1969 and 72, producers attempted to win over Timothy Dalton to play the role of James Bond. However, at the time, Timothy feared he was too young for the role and was terrified to follow up the amazing performance of Sean Connery. It wasn't until 1986 he finally accepted. Roger Green auditioned in 1970, but Sean Connery once again prevailed. Simon Dee was mostly viewed as a talk show host, so most people didn't seriously consider his audition in 1971. William Gaunt auditioned for the James Bond film Live and Let Die in 1971, but Roger Moore was chosen instead. American actor John Gavin was almost considered to play the first non-English James Bond, but Sean Connery decided to reprise his role in 1971. After John Gavin auditioned again in 1973, the producers decided James Bond was best played by an English actor. If you think the role of James Bond should have been given to actors outside of England, click the like button. In 1971, Simon Oates was very close to winning the role, but Sean Connery returned and was immediately selected. He was called back for an audition in 1973, but at the time he was already involved in other projects. Peter Lawton was strongly considered in 1972, but his limited acting experience made the producers wary, and they eventually chose Roger Moore instead. Guy Pearce auditioned in 1972, but the producers wanted an actor whose face was already well known. While Timothy Dalton was requested to play Bond in 1979, he was dissatisfied with where the movies were headed, and it wasn't until '86 that he accepted. David Warbeck auditioned in 1979, but the producers considered his acting too stiff for the role. Michael Jaston and Patrick Mower were both close to playing Bond in 1980 when Roger Moore considered quitting. However, Moore ultimately decided to stay. While Lewis Collins auditioned in 1982, the producers thought his acting style was too aggressive. Ian Ogilvy was yet another actor who attempted to win the role while Roger Moore contemplated quitting the series, but in 1983, Roger Moore returned. In 1983, James Brolin was so close to winning the role, he bought a new house in London, but Roger Moore agreed to return, leaving Brolin disappointed. Pierce Brosnan almost played Bond in 1986, but he was too busy playing the role of Remington Steele at the time. Although Daniel Pylon, Sam Neill, and Anthony Hamilton all auditioned in 1986, Timothy Dalton was chosen instead to play Bond. Mel Gibson was requested to audition in 1987, but was declined by Albert Broccoli because he wasn't British. The picky producers decided that due to Christopher Lambert's French accent, they would decline his 1987 audition. Neil Dixon, Mark Greenstreet, and Simon McCorkindale all auditioned for the role in 1987, but Timothy Dalton was chosen instead. In 1987, an obscure Australian model, Finlay Light, was so close to winning the role of Bond in The Living Daylights, he signed a 10-year contract. Unfortunately for him, Timothy Dalton was chosen instead. Andrew Clark was possibly the most popular actor in Australia in the 80s, but his fame down under wasn't enough to beat Timothy Dalton in 1987. In 1994, after Timothy Dalton's long reign as Bond, Mark Frankel and Lambert Wilson were both given the opportunity to audition as the new James Bond. However, Pierce Brosnan was granted the coveted role instead. Paul McGann was very close to playing Bond after his impressive 1994 audition. While Pierce Brosnan was chosen to play the new James Bond, it was likely Paul McGann would have played Bond if Pierce Brosnan ever decided to quit. Director Martin Campbell wanted Henry Cavill to play James Bond in 2005, but the producers decided he was simply too young for the role at the time. Sam Worthington, Rupert Friend, and Julian McMahon all auditioned for James Bond in 2005, but Daniel Craig was chosen instead. Alex O'Loughlin and Clive Owen tried their best to win the role in 2005, but Daniel Craig was chosen instead. Finally, Dougray Scott auditioned in 2005, but it's unknown why he wasn't accepted. That's it for our list of failed auditions over the years. However, there were also a lot of actors who the producers and directors reached out to when casting. This next list includes actors who were considered for the role, but for whatever reason, they decided to decline. In 1959, 1961, and 1968, the producers of the films asked Richard Burton to play the role of James Bond. However, Burton felt that the role was too risky, and he didn't want it to harm his career. He was willing to play the role, but for a steep price that the producers considered too expensive. In 1961, Cary Grant was considered to play James Bond. The actor, however, was 58 at the time, and he felt he was too old to play James Bond. Furthermore, it was intended to be a series of movies, and Grant was only interested in doing one movie at the most. Director Terrence Young wanted Richard Johnson to play James Bond in 1961. However, Johnson already had a contract with MGM and didn't want another. James Mason was offered a contract for 3 films in 1961, but Mason was only interested in 2 and was thus declined. Later, he was called back to potentially play the villain in the film Moonraker, but Michael Lonsdale was chosen instead. Patrick McGoohan thought the role of James Bond was too promiscuous, and he turned down the offer in 1961. No matter how coveted the role of James Bond was considered to be, there will always be people who think they are above everyone else. While Rod Taylor was offered the role in 1961, he thought the part was beneath him and declined it. While Steve Reeves was offered the role in 1962, he requested higher pay than the producers were willing to provide. John Bingham, 7th Earl of Lucan, was offered the role in 1967 from co-producer Albert Broccoli. However, Bingham decided he no longer wanted to pursue acting and declined the role. Later in life, this turned out to be a good thing, as he mysteriously vanished when the nanny of his children was murdered. Michael Gambon, most famous for playing Harry Potter's Dumbledore, was offered to play James Bond in 1970. Poor Gambon thought he wasn't handsome enough, and he declined the offer. Burt Reynolds, Clint Eastwood, and Adam West were all offered the role in 1970, but they felt that Bond was best played by a British actor, so they declined. In 1972, John Finch was offered the role, but he declined because he didn't want to play James Bond. Liam Neeson was offered the role in 1994, but he declined, claiming he didn't want to star in any action films at that time. Later, however, it was revealed that his girlfriend told him she wouldn't marry him if he accepted the role, although her reasoning is unknown. In 2005, Dominic West was offered the role after Pierce Brosnan left. However, West heard a rumor that Brosnan was planning to return, and West, feeling he wasn't good enough to beat Brosnan, declined. Finally, Christian Bale had heated opinions about James Bond when he was offered the role in 2005. He thought the films were far too British, and he hated the stereotypes present through the franchise. This next section covers actors who auditioned for the role of James Bond but were chosen to play other characters in the films instead. In 1962, George Baker auditioned for James Bond, but was instead chosen to play the characters of Sir Hilary Bray and Captain Benson in later films. After years of auditioning for the role, Michael Billington was finally granted an appearance as Sergei Barsov in the film The Spy Who Loved Me, 1977. Julian Glover auditioned for Bond in 1979, but was instead granted the role of Aristotle Christatos in 1981. Sean Bean auditioned in both 1987 and 1994. It wasn't until 1995 that he would play the villain Alec Trevelyan. Ralph Fiennes attempted to win the role of Bond in both 1994 and 2004. However, he was cruelly described as having hands too big and a face like a farmer. He ended up playing the character Gareth Mallory, also known as M, in 2012, 2015, and 2020. In 2005, Colin Salmon auditioned to play Bond. Instead, he played Charles Robinson in 1997, 1999, and 2002. Daniel Craig has been playing the role of James Bond since 2005, but there are rumors he'll be replaced soon by another actor. Some of these potential actors include Richard Madden, Tom Hiddleston, Henry Cavill, and Tom Hardy. However, while James Bond has always been played by a white man, the world has changed drastically over the years. Idris Elba is being considered for the first actor of color to play James Bond. Actresses Charlize Theron and Alicia Vikander are also being considered to play the world's first female James Bond. The iconic role of James Bond has changed a lot over the years. Do you think the James Bond actors that have been chosen were the best actors for the job, or do you think some of the actors on this list should have been chosen instead? Let us know in the comments below. And before you go, be sure to like this video, and don't forget to subscribe to Facts Verse for more.